Beat me and I'll marry you. The words, dripping with disdain, echoed across the sun-drenched tennis court. Teresa Langley, CEO of Langley Enterprises, stood poised and perfect. Her designer tennis dress, a stark white against the green court, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate ponytail that left no room for error, much like the woman herself. She held her racket with a light but punishing grip, a weapon she wielded with the same ruthless precision she used in the boardroom. The charity match was a necessary nuisance, a performance for investors in the press, but her competitive streak was a fire that burned hot and constant. Losing, even in a meaningless game, was not an option. Her opponent, a rival CEO named Mark, was sweating through his polo shirt, but it wasn't his pathetic performance that had fractured Teresa's concentration. It was the man near the bleachers, the one quietly sweeping stray leaves into a long-handled dustpan, a ghost in a gray uniform meant to be invisible. He had flinched, a sudden sharp movement, when a stray ball had rocketed off Mark's racket and slammed into the chain-link fence just inches from a small girl sitting on the lowest bench. Daughter, presumably. The janitor's sudden move had drawn Teresa's eye for a split second, a fatal lapse. The ball came back over the net and she hit it wide. A collective groan rippled through the crowd of executives and socialites. It wasn't the lost point that angered her. It was the imperfection, the intrusion of the outside world into her controlled arena. She glared toward the janitor, who was now murmuring something to the little girl, his broad back turned to the court. Now all eyes were on him. Owen Harper, the resort's janitor, stood frozen, his hand still on the broom. He turned slowly, his face a mask of quiet apology, but Teresa saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of fear not for himself but for the child who now huddled closer to him. The crowd of tailored suits and silk dresses chuckled, sensing a diversion. Teresa smirked, the familiar, cruel twist of her lips that her subordinates knew all too well. It was the smile she wore right before a hostile takeover. She was going to make an example of him. "What's the matter?" she taunted, her voice carrying across the court with chilling clarity. "Don't have the guts to play for a prize like me." The laughter grew louder, laced with the casual cruelty of the wealthy and powerful. Owen's face flushed a deep red. He looked down at the broom in his hand as if it were an anchor weighing him down. He was a man used to being overlooked, to blending into the background. Being the center of attention was a nightmare, especially this kind of attention. Mocking, predatory, his eyes flickered to his daughter, Lily, whose small face was now filled with a terror that twisted a knife in his gut. She was pale, her skin almost translucent in the bright sun, and her eyes, wide and blue, were fixed on Teresa Langley as if she were a monster from a fairy tale. Lily's breath was coming in shallow little puffs, a rhythm he knew all too well. It was the prelude to one of her episodes, the terrifying moments when her fragile heart struggled to keep up. He had to end this. Now he looked back at the CEO, and the desperation in his gaze hardened into something else. A flinty resolve that no one on that court could have possibly understood. It was the look of a man with nothing left to lose. A man who would walk through fire for the small, frightened girl on the bench. The prize money for this tournament wasn't just a number to him. It was a down payment on a miracle. It was a chance, however slim, to afford the surgery that could save Lily's life. His invisibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. He leaned the broom against the wall, the metallic scrape loud in the sudden hush. "Fine," he said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I'll play." A wave of shocked silence followed by a burst of incredulous laughter swept through the spectators. Mark, her opponent, looked utterly bewildered. Teresa's smirk widened. This was better than she could have hoped for. The janitor had taken the bait. She would dismantle him point by agonizing point. It would be a lesson in knowing one's place. "Someone get the man a racket," she commanded, gesturing dismissively with her own. A young attendant, trying to stifle a grin, hurried over with a spare racket from the club's collection. He offered it to Owen, who took it without a word. He walked onto the court, his work boots scuffing the pristine surface. He looked out of place, a crow in a flock of peacocks. He didn't look at the crowd, at the sea of amused, disdainful faces. He looked only at Lily, giving her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's okay. I've got this." Teresa watched him, a predator sizing up her prey. His hands were calloused from manual labor. His uniform was worn at the elbows, and there was a weariness in his posture that spoke of long hours and little rest. He was nothing, a nobody. She would make this quick. "Let's make this interesting," she said, walking to her position at the baseline. "We'll play one set, first to 6 games wins, and the prize money for the tournament goes to the winner's chosen charity." Her own charity, of course, was a foundation for corporate leadership, a self-serving monument to her own success. She had no idea what a man like him would even do with the money. Buy a new broom, perhaps. Owen simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He bounced the tennis ball once, twice. The sound was flat, ordinary. The crowd settled in for the spectacle, the CEO versus the janitor. It was a farce, a bit of cruel entertainment before the champagne reception. Teresa tossed the ball into the air for her first serve, her body coiling like a spring, ready to unleash the power that had crushed countless opponents. This would be over in 10 minutes, but as she made contact, she saw something shift in the man across the net. The weary slump was gone. His feet were planted, his body was balanced, and his eyes, the eyes that had been downcast and apologetic just moments before, were now fixed on the ball with an intensity that sent a bizarre, unwelcome shiver down her spine. The joke, she realized with a sudden, sickening jolt, might not be on him. The yellow ball was a blur of speed and precision, an ace aimed at the far corner of the service box. It was Teresa's signature serve, a missile designed to be unreturnable, a statement of dominance. She didn't even watch it land. She was already turning, expecting the satisfying thud of the ball against the back wall and the polite applause for a point well laid. Instead, she heard a sound that didn't belong. A sharp, explosive crack as strings met ball, followed by a gasp from the crowd. Teresa spun around just in time to see the ball streak past her, a yellow comet kissing the baseline on the opposite side of the court. It was a clean winner, untouchable. Her mind couldn't process it. It was a fluke, a lucky swing from a man who had no business even holding a racket. Owen Harper hadn't moved with the clumsiness of a novice. He had pivoted on the ball of his foot, his body uncoiling in a single fluid motion of kinetic energy. His form was flawless, a textbook display of power and grace that was so at odds with his worn uniform, it felt like a hallucination. 15 love, the umpire's voice called out, sounding slightly dazed. Teresa's jaw tightened, annoyance prickled at her skin. She grabbed another ball, her movements now sharp and angry. She tossed it higher this time, putting every ounce of her frustration into the next serve. This one was even faster, aimed right at his body to jam him, but Owen read it perfectly. He took a small step back, his body flowing around the ball, and met it with a backhand slice that sent it skimming low over the net. It landed softly just a few feet from the net and died on the court with a wicked backspin. There was no way she could have reached it. 30 love. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The snickering had stopped. Now there was only a tense, confused silence. People were leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't a joke anymore. Teresa stared across the net, her heart starting to pound with a strange mixture of fury and disbelief. He wasn't just returning her serves. He was dismantling her game. He was anticipating her every move, countering her power with strategy, her aggression with a calm, almost unnerving precision. She managed to win the next point on a fault, but the small victory felt hollow. For the rest of the game, he was always one step ahead. He moved with an economy of motion, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground. His worn work boots, which had looked so clumsy just minutes ago, now seemed to glide across the court. The janitor was gone. In his place was a player of terrifying skill. He won the first game, then the second. By the third game, Teresa was playing desperately, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. She was hitting the ball harder, aiming for the lines, taking risks she never would normally take, but he was a brick wall. Everything she threw at him came back, often faster and placed more cleverly than her original shot. The calloused hands she had mocked now held the racket with an artist's sensitivity, angling shots, changing the pace, controlling the entire rhythm of the match. In the stands, a veteran sports journalist who was only there to get a quote from a banking executive for a financial piece lowered his phone. He squinted, his eyes fixed on Owen's unique, slightly open stance before his forehand. He'd seen it before, years ago. A young phenom, a kid they called the Rocket for his explosive style, a player who had been destined for Grand Slam titles before he'd simply vanished. It couldn't be. That kid would be in his late 30s now, not sweeping floors at a luxury resort. It had to be a coincidence. 4, the umpire announced. The crowd was completely silent now, watching with a kind of breathless awe. They were witnessing an impossibility. The carefully ordered world of their social hierarchy was being turned upside down on a tennis court. Teresa walked to the sideline to towel off, her hands trembling. She wasn't just losing, she was being systematically humiliated. The man across the net wasn't even breathing hard. He stood at his baseline, his face impassive, but his eyes kept darting to the bench where his daughter sat. He wasn't playing against Teresa. He was playing for that little girl. She looked over at Lily. The child was no longer scared. She was watching her father with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride, her small hands clasped together. In her eyes, her father wasn't a janitor being mocked by a CEO. He was a hero. The realization hit Teresa with the force of a physical blow. She had tried to make this man small, to crush him under the weight of her status and power, but she couldn't. His strength didn't come from a corporate title or a bank account. It came from something deeper, something she couldn't touch or buy. She returned to the court, her mind reeling. The smug satisfaction was gone, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar dread. Who was this man? Did a resort janitor learn to play tennis like a forgotten champion? Every blistering serve he fired at her, every impossible return he made was another question she couldn't answer. The match was no longer about winning. It was about survival. She had to take a game, just one, to salvage a shred of her dignity. But as he tossed the ball to begin his own service game, his body coiling with the same latent power she'd seen in the world's top professionals, she knew she wasn't just going to lose. She was going to be erased. The sound of Owen's serve was like a gunshot. It wasn't the clean thwack of a club player. It was a heavy concussive boom that spoke of years of disciplined, brutal practice. The ball flew not just fast, but with a ferocious spin that made it kick off the court like a startled animal. Teresa lunged, but her racket met only air. Ace. He walked to the other side of the court, his expression unchanged. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ball in his hand, his focus absolute. He served again, another cannonball, this time to her backhand. She managed to get her racket on it, but the force of the shot nearly tore it from her grip. The ball looped weakly into the bottom of the net. The rest of the game was a blur of power and precision. In less than 2 minutes, it was over. The score was now 5-0. One more game and her humiliation would be complete. A 6-0 loss, a bagel in front of her board members, her rivals, and the media. The thought was so mortifying it made her feel physically ill. She glanced toward the bleachers, her eyes finding Lily Harper. The little girl was no longer just watching. She was beaming, her small face lit up with a joy so pure it was almost painful to look at. As Owen walked back to the baseline to receive Teresa's serve, Lily coughed, a small, dry sound that was quickly muffled into her hand. Owen's head snapped toward her for a fraction of a second, his focus breaking just long enough to see if she was okay. In that fleeting glance, Teresa saw it all. The raw fear, the crushing weight of responsibility, the desperate love of a father terrified of losing his world. This wasn't about tennis. This wasn't about her or her arrogant challenge. This was a man fighting for his daughter's life with the only weapon he had left. The knowledge didn't make her feel better. It made her feel worse. It made her feel small. She walked to the baseline to serve for the final game, her legs feeling like lead. Her pride demanded that she fight, that she not go down without leaving a mark. She channeled all her rage and confusion into her game, playing with a ferocity that surprised even herself. For a few brief moments, it felt like a real match. They engaged in a blistering rally, a frantic exchange of cross-court forehands and sharp, angled volleys that had the crowd gasping. She was a skilled player, a former collegiate champion, and she forced him to move, to run, to show the full extent of his talent. She won a point, then another. The crowd offered a smattering of polite, almost pitying applause, but for every point she clawed back, he answered with 2 of his own, each one more brilliant than the last. He was toying with her, she realized with a sickening lurch. He could end this whenever he wanted. He was drawing it out not to humiliate her further, but to control the pace, to conserve the energy he so clearly needed for battles fought off the court. Then it came. Match point, 40-30. Teresa served, putting everything she had left into it. It was a good serve, deep and fast. He returned it with a casual flick of his wrist, a soft looping shot that landed deep in her court. It was a setup. He was inviting her to attack. Her instinct screamed at her to hit it hard, to go for a winner. She ran up and smashed an approach shot down the line. It was a perfect shot, one that would have won the point against any other opponent she had ever faced. But Owen was already there, as if he knew where the ball was going before she even hit it. He glided to his right and with a breathtakingly graceful drop shot, angled the ball just over the net. It landed with the softness of a falling leaf and died, spinning away before she could even take a step toward it. The game and the set was over. 6. Silence, a deep, profound silence fell over the court, and then the applause started. It wasn't the polite clapping of a corporate event. It was a roar, an explosion of genuine thunderous applause, not for the CEO but for the janitor who had played like a king. Teresa stood frozen, her racket hanging loosely from her hand. The sound washed over her, a wave of public judgment. She had never been on this side of it before. She was the one people applauded. She was the winner. Owen walked to the net, his face calm, the mask of the stoic janitor sliding back into place. The fire in his eyes was banked, the fluid grace of the athlete receding back into the weary posture of the working man. He extended his hand. It was a simple professional gesture devoid of triumph or malice. For a long moment she just stared at his callous hand. Shaking it felt like surrender, not just of the match, but of her entire worldview. But not shaking it would be a public display of petulance, a confirmation of everything her worst critics said about her. Her own hand moved, seemingly of its own accord, and met his. His grip was firm, his hand rough. The handshake lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. "Good game," he murmured, his voice low, before turning and walking away. He didn't look back. Teresa watched him go, her mind a chaotic storm of questions. He walked directly to his daughter, scooping her up into a fierce hug. Lily wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. At the edge of the court, the sports journalist was already moving, his notebook out, his face alight with the thrill of a career-defining story. Teresa was left alone in the middle of the court, the sound of the applause for another person ringing in her ears. The sun felt cold. The perfect, orderly world she had built for herself lay in ruins at her feet, destroyed by a quiet man with a broom and a secret that was screaming to be told. The applause began to die down, replaced by an excited, frenzied buzz. People were swarming off the bleachers, their phones held up, trying to get a picture of the man of the hour. Owen held Lily tighter, turning his body to shield her from the sudden onslaught of attention. He just wanted to disappear, to melt back into the shadows where he belonged, but it was too late. A man with a press badge and the hungry eyes of a predator was already pushing through the crowd, heading straight for them. "That was incredible," the man said, flipping open a notepad. "Miles Davenport, Sports Chronicle. I have to ask that forehand, the service motion. I've only ever seen it once before. You're Owen the Rocket Harper, aren't you? You disappeared after the circuit in 2015. Everyone thought you were." "You're mistaken," Owen cut in, his voice low and tight with panic. He started to move away, trying to find a path through the throng of onlookers. "I'm no one, just a guy who got lucky." "Lucky?" Davenport scoffed, easily keeping pace. "That wasn't luck, that was world-class talent. The world has been asking what happened to you for 10 years. You can't just show up and beat a CEO 6 and expect no one to notice. What's your story?" Owen's jaw clenched. He could feel Lily trembling in his arms. This was his worst nightmare realized. The past he had buried so carefully was being unearthed with a shovel right in front of his daughter. "Please," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper, "leave us alone." From the center of the court, Teresa watched the scene unfold. She saw the panic in Owen's eyes, the predatory gleam in the reporters. The crowd was closing in like vultures. Part of her, the cold, calculating CEO, told her to walk away. This was his mess. She could go to the clubhouse, issue a statement about sportsmanship, and begin the long, arduous process of damage control. Let the janitor fend for himself. But another part of her, a part she hadn't felt in years, couldn't move. She saw the little girl's face, pale and terrified, and remembered the look in Owen's eyes when he'd played. He had fought like a man defending his kingdom, and she, in her arrogance, had forced his kingdom into the open, leaving it vulnerable to attack. She was the cause of this. With a resolve that surprised herself, she strode toward them, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the pavement. The crowd parted for her instinctively, a sea of whispers falling silent as she approached. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice like ice. It was the voice she used to kill billion-dollar deals, and it stopped the reporter in his tracks. "The charity event is over. Our staff are now off the clock." She put a pointed emphasis on the word staff. "I'm sure you have better things to do than harass a man trying to take his daughter home." Davenport looked from Teresa's furious face to Owen's panicked one. He smelled a story far bigger than a washed-up athlete. This had layers, but he also knew Teresa Langley's power. One phone call from her could have him blacklisted from every major sporting event in the country. He gave a tight, resentful smile. "Of course, Ms. Langley, just doing my job." He backed away slowly, his eyes still locked on Owen, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Once he was gone, the rest of the crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the drama was over. Soon, the three of them were left in a tense, echoing silence on the edge of the court. Lily was still clinging to her father, her face hidden in his neck. Teresa crossed her arms, the familiar defensive posture feeling flimsy and inadequate. "You're welcome," she said stiffly. Owen didn't look at her. "I didn't ask for your help. I asked to be left alone, something you seem to have a problem with." The gratitude she expected was absent, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. "I need answers," she said, ignoring the jab. "Who are you?" This time the question was not a public taunt, but a genuine burning inquiry. A performance like that doesn't come from nowhere. Davenport was right, wasn't he? "I'm the janitor." Owen shot back, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were hard. "You made that very clear, and now, thanks to you, my daughter is terrified and my life is about to become a circus. I hope it was worth it for you." He turned to leave. "Wait," she said, a new awful thought occurring to her. He stopped, his back still to her. "What about it? You said you only played for the money," she stated, piecing it together. The sick daughter, the desperation, it was clicking into place. "That's right," he said without turning. "The tournament purse, $50,000. Teresa's stomach dropped, the cold dread from the match returned, but this time it was laced with something that felt horribly like pity. "Owen," she said, using his first name without thinking. "This is a charity event. The prize money isn't cash, it's a formal donation. It goes directly from my company's foundation to a registered 501c3 charity of the winner's choice. You can't just take it." He turned around slowly. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty ashen gray. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a look of such profound, gut-wrenching horror that Teresa had to look away. He had endured a public spectacle, exposed his deepest secret, and won all for nothing. "What?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, that can't be right." "It's the law," she said softly, the words feeling like poison in her mouth. "There are tax regulations for corporate philanthropy. The money never touches the winner's hands." He stared at her, his mind clearly struggling to process the information. The hope that had fueled him through the match, the single burning light at the end of his very dark tunnel, had just been extinguished. He had gambled everything and lost. "No," Owen breathed, the word a hollow puff of air. He took a staggering step back, his mind refusing to accept what she was saying. No, you're lying, it's a trick. Why would I lie about that? Teresa said, her voice softer than she intended. She was watching a man completely unravel, and the sight was deeply unsettling. Because you're cruel, he finally exploded, his voice raw with anguish. Because you saw me a janitor and you wanted to make a fool of me. And when that didn't work, when I beat you, you had to find another way to win, another way to crush me. Daddy, I don't feel so good. The small, weak voice cut through Owen's rage like a shard of glass. Both he and Teresa looked down at Lily. The little girl's face was alarmingly pale, her lips tinged with a faint bluish hue. She was leaning heavily against her father's leg, her breathing shallow and rapid. Leebug, Owen's anger evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold wave of terror. He knelt, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her as if she might break. What is it? What hurts? My chest, she whispered, her eyes wide and frightened. It feels tight, like a balloon. Owen's hands flew to the small pouch he wore on his belt, fumbling with the zipper. He pulled out an inhaler and a small digital pulse oximeter. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely clip the device onto her tiny finger. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying the number would be stable. When he opened them, the red digits glowed back at him, stark and unforgiving. 84%, dangerously low. Okay, baby, okay, he said, trying to keep his voice from trembling. We're just going to do a little breathing treatment just like we practice, remember? Nice and slow. He tried to administer the inhaler, but Lily was starting to panic, her short breaths turning into gasps. Teresa stood frozen, a spectator to a scene of pure primal fear. This was real. This wasn't a story to be spun by the press or a problem to be solved by her legal team. This was a little girl who couldn't breathe. The tightness in Lily's chest seemed to radiate outwards, squeezing the air from Teresa's own lungs. All the power, all the money, all the influence she commanded meant absolutely nothing in this moment. She was useless. Owen looked up at her, his eyes wild with desperation. The anger and resentment were gone, replaced by a silent, agonizing plea. He was a father watching his child slip away, and he was utterly alone. Something inside Teresa snapped. The years of carefully constructed emotional armor of ruthless ambition and calculated indifference shattered. She was no longer a CEO. She was the only other person there. My car, she said, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the haze of panic. It's right there. It'll be faster than an ambulance. Owen didn't question her. He scooped the frighteningly light body of his daughter into his arms and ran, following Teresa to the gleaming black sedan parked in the VIP section. She remotely unlocked the doors and he scrambled into the back seat, cradling Lily, whispering to her, begging her to stay with him. Teresa slid into the driver's seat, her hands steady on the leather-wrapped wheel. She peeled out of the resort's parking lot with a squeal of tires that turned the heads of the last lingering guests. The drive was a blur of blaring horns and swerving around slower cars. Teresa drove with a focused fury, her entire being narrowed down to a single objective: get to the hospital. In the rear-view mirror, she could see them. Owen had Lily's head resting on his chest, his hand stroking her hair. He was humming softly, a broken, tuneless melody, but his voice was a lifeline of calm in the chaos. He was trying to regulate her breathing with the sound to give her an anchor. She saw him check the oximeter again. He didn't say the number out loud, but she saw his face crumple for a second before he smoothed it back into a mask of calm for his daughter. They were in their own world back there, a tiny island of two against an ocean of pain. And Teresa, the woman who had everything, was on the outside, a stranger looking in at a kind of love and terror she had never known. The $50,000 that was the source of all this felt like a pittance, an insult to the scale of the battle this man was fighting every single day. She pulled into the emergency bay of the city hospital, slamming the car into park long before it had fully stopped. Go, she yelled. Owen was out of the door before she finished the word, running with Lily into the automatic doors, his desperate cries for help echoing in the concrete garage. Teresa was left alone in the sudden, deafening silence of her car. The engine ticked as it cooled. The smell of expensive leather filled the air. On the back seat lay a discarded inhaler and a small pink ribbon that had fallen from Lily's hair. She stared at it, this tiny, insignificant object, and felt the full weight of what she had done. She had set a fire just to watch it burn, never imagining that a child's life was in the middle of the flames. Could leave, she could drive away, transfer the money to a respectable charity, and send an anonymous check to the hospital. She could erase this entire day, bury it under a mountain of work, and pretend it never happened. But as she reached for the gearshift, her eyes fell on the pink ribbon again. She couldn't, she wouldn't. She turned off the car, got out, and with a deep, shaky breath, she walked through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, following the man whose life she had so carelessly broken into. The emergency room was a cacophony of controlled chaos. The air smelled of antiseptic, bleach, and a faint metallic scent of fear. A baby was crying in long, panicked wails. A man with a blood-soaked bandage around his head was shouting at a nurse, and the overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly buzzing sound. For Teresa Langley, whose life was a curated sequence of silent boardrooms, hushed art galleries, and the serene quiet of her penthouse, it felt like a war zone. She was an intruder here. Her expensive silk blouse and tailored slacks, a ridiculous costume in a world of scrubs, sickness, and raw human suffering. She found Owen in a small, crowded waiting area. He wasn't sitting. He was pacing, carving a frantic path in the worn linoleum, his hands raking through his hair. A nurse had taken Lily from him the moment they'd burst through the doors, and a curtain had been pulled, hiding her from view. He was left on the outside, a powerless parent waiting for a verdict. He didn't notice Teresa until she was standing directly in his path. He stopped, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "What are you still doing here?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Haven't you done enough? This is a private matter." Teresa started, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? "I'm sorry, I'm responsible." The phrases felt cheap, meaningless in the face of the terror on his face. For the first time in her adult life, she had no script, no strategy. She couldn't command this situation. She couldn't intimidate it. She could only stand in it. "I wanted to make sure she was okay," she finished lamely. Owen let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "She's not okay. She's never been okay. You just made it worse." Before she could respond, a doctor in blue scrubs pushed through a set of swinging doors, calling his name. "Mr. Harper." Owen spun around, his entire body rigid with anticipation. "Is she all right? Can I see her?" The doctor, a tired-looking man with kind eyes, led him a few feet away for a semblance of privacy. Teresa stayed where she was, but in the small, loud room. It was impossible not to overhear. "We've stabilized her for now," the doctor said gently. "We have her on oxygen and her SATs are back up to 90%. But Owen, that was a severe cyanotic spell, one of the worst she's had." "I know," Owen choked out. "The beta blockers aren't as effective as they used to be." The doctor continued, his voice low and serious. "Her heart is having to work too hard. We've been talking about this for months, but I think we're out of time. She needs the Fontan procedure." Teresa watched Owen's shoulders slump as if the doctor's words were a physical weight. "But it's not just the standard Fontan," the doctor added. "Her specific case, the scarring from the initial surgeries. Dr. Alistair Finch over at the Children's National Institute has pioneered an experimental version, extracardiac with a tissue-engineered graft. The success rates for kids with her complex physiology are promising. It's her best and frankly her only real long-term shot." Dr. Finch. Owen repeated the name like a prayer and a curse. "We can't afford him, you know that. My insurance won't touch anything experimental. The cost is," he trailed off, shaking his head in defeat. "I know," the doctor said with genuine sympathy. "It's $500,000 minimum, and that's just for the procedure itself, not the aftercare." He placed a hand on Owen's shoulder. "We'll keep her here overnight for observation. You can see her in a few minutes. Just try to be strong for her, okay?" The doctor gave Teresa a brief, curious glance before disappearing back through the doors. Owen just stood there staring at the closed doors, looking utterly and completely broken. All the fight, all the fire she'd seen on the court was gone. He was just a man who had hit a wall he could never climb, a wall made of money, a wall she could tear down with a single phone call. He stumbled over to a hard plastic chair and collapsed into it, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. Teresa watched him, and the last of her anger, her pride, and her resentment dissolved. It was replaced by clarity so sharp and bright it felt like a physical pain in her chest. She had done this. Her stupid, arrogant game had pushed him into the light, and the light had revealed an impossible, unbearable truth. She had the power to fix it. The thought was terrifying. It was a responsibility she had never asked for, a debt she didn't know how to repay. But walking away was no longer an option. It would be an act of cowardice, so profound it would poison the rest of her life. She walked over and stood in front of him. He didn't look up. "I'll cover it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the ER. Owen's head snapped up, his face streaked with tears, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock. "What?" "The surgery," she said, her voice gaining strength, gaining certainty. "Dr. Finch, the $500,000, all of it, I'll pay for it." Owen just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at her as if she just sprouted wings. There was no relief in his eyes, no gratitude, only a deep, bottomless suspicion. "Why?" he whispered, his voice. "Why would you do that?" Teresa met Owen's suspicious gaze without flinching. The question hung in the sterile air between them, heavy and sharp. Why? For a woman who always had a calculated reason for every action, the honest answer was a chaotic mess of motives she didn't fully understand herself. Guilt was the largest part, a bitter pill she wasn't used to swallowing, but there was something else, too. A sliver of admiration for the fight she'd seen in him, and a stark, jarring realization that for all her wealth, his world contained a depth of meaning that hers sorely lacked. "Because I broke your life open," she said, her voice low and even. "I put you and your daughter under a spotlight you never asked for, all for a cheap laugh. I was arrogant and cruel, and this is the consequence." She took a breath, forcing the words out. "This isn't charity, Owen. This is a debt, and I always pay my debts." He shook his head, a disbelieving scowl on his face. A debt. You think you can just write a check and fix this. You think you can buy your way out of what you did. I don't know what I think, she admitted, the honesty feeling foreign on her tongue. But I know that I have the resources to give your daughter the only chance her doctor says she has. Money is the wall standing in your way. For me, that wall doesn't exist. It's that simple. I don't want your money, he said, his voice thick with a pride that seemed almost suicidal in its intensity. I don't want anything from you. We were managing. We've always managed. Managing. Teresa's patience, never a deep well to begin with, began to fray. Her pragmatic CEO brain took over. Your daughter just had a critical medical event in the middle of a parking lot. Her doctor said she's out of time. You call that managing? The words were harsh, but they were true. This has nothing to do with me or you or your pride. This is about Lily. Are you really going to let her die because you don't want to accept help from me? The brutal question hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes squeezed shut. He had no answer. Every protective instinct, every fiber of his being screamed at him to refuse to run from this woman who operated on a level he couldn't comprehend. But the image of Lily, pale and gasping for air, was burned into his mind. A nurse pushed through the doors. Mr. Harper, Lily's asking for you. You can go in now. 5 minutes. The interruption was a reprieve. Owen pushed himself to his feet, his body moving stiffly. He looked at Teresa, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. I need to see my daughter, he said, the words a dismissal and a surrender all at once. He turned and walked through the doors without another word, leaving Teresa alone with his unspoken answer. She watched him go, then turned and walked purposefully toward the exit, pulling out her phone. She didn't need his permission. He was a father drowning in grief and pride. He couldn't see the lifeline right in front of him, so she would throw it to him anyway. She stepped out into the cool night air and dialed the number of her chief of staff, a woman who could move mountains before breakfast. Mara, wake up, I need you, she said, her voice all business. I'm sending you a name. Dr. Soren Hayes, a pediatric cardiac surgeon at the Children's National Institute. I want his office contacted first thing in the morning. Tell them it's on behalf of the Langley Foundation. We have a patient, Lily Harper, currently at City General. I want her transferred there by the end of the day tomorrow. Arrange for a private medical transport. She paused, listening to the sleepy but efficient affirmations on the other end. Next, I want you to set up a new ring-fence trust. Fund it with $2 million to start. It's to cover all medical and ancillary expenses for the Harper family. No limits, no questions asked. I want our top financial people to have it legally structured by sunrise. And Mara, Teresa added, lowering her voice, one more thing. I need a complete confidential background check on the father. Owen Harper, he's a former professional tennis player. Went by the nickname The Rocket. He disappeared about 10 years ago. I want to know everything. Why he quit, the accident, his wife, his finances, his old sponsors, everything. I need to know exactly who I'm dealing with, and it needs to be completely discreet. She ended the call just as Owen pushed back through the emergency room doors. He looked even more wrecked than before. Seeing Lily so small and fragile in the hospital bed had clearly taken its toll. He stopped when he saw Teresa, a weary resignation on his face. Look about your offer, he started, clearly about to argue again. Teresa cut him off, her tone leaving no room for debate. Dr. Hayes' office will be calling you in the morning to schedule an immediate consultation, she said calmly. A medical transport team is being arranged to take Lily to the institute as soon as she's stable. All of it is handled. Owen stared at her, stunned into silence. She hadn't waited for him to accept, she had simply done it. He was no longer in control of his own life. He was a passenger in a rescue mission he had never agreed to, captained by the one person he had every reason to despise. The terrifying thing was it was a rescue that might actually work. For a long moment, Owen just stared at her, the words failing to form. He felt like a man standing on a cliff edge who had just been pushed, only to find he'd been given wings instead of being left to fall. The feeling was disorienting, a nauseating mix of fury at her audacity and a profound bone-deep relief that stole the strength from his legs. You had no right, he finally managed to say, but the words had no heat. They were the last dying embers of a pride he could no longer afford. Probably not, Teresa agreed, her expression unreadable in the harsh hospital lighting. But I did it anyway. Your only job now is to be with your daughter. Let me handle the rest. The rest, as she called it, unfolded with the terrifying efficiency of a military operation. Within hours, a private medical ambulance arrived, staffed by a team of calm, reassuring professionals. They transferred Lily onto a gurney with such gentle expertise that she barely stirred. The journey to the Children's National Institute was quiet, the ride smooth and silent, a world away from Teresa's frantic, horn-blaring drive to the city. Owen sat beside his daughter, holding her hand, watching the city lights blur past the window, feeling like he'd been abducted onto another planet, a planet where money solved impossible problems. The institute was less a hospital and more a futuristic temple of healing. Soft lighting, calming art on the walls, and a quiet, competent hush replaced the chaotic den they'd left behind. Lily was settled into a private room with a view of a garden, a room larger than Owen's entire apartment. The next morning they met Dr. Soren Hayes. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a reassuring presence and eyes that saw everything. He spoke to Owen directly, treating him not as an accessory to Teresa's wealth, but as the most important person in the room, Lily's father. He pulled up complex diagrams of the heart on a large screen, explaining the dangers of Lily's condition and the intricate, high-risk genius of the surgical solution. The procedure is a marathon, not a sprint, Dr. Hayes explained calmly. We're essentially plumbing her entire circulatory system. There are significant risks, infection, clots, rejection of the graft, but without it, he paused, letting the unspoken reality hang in the air. Without it, she may not have more than a few months. With it, she has a chance, a real one. She could live a full, happy life. Owen listened, absorbing every word, asking intelligent, informed questions that clearly impressed the doctor. Teresa stayed in the background, a silent observer. She saw the way Owen's hands were clasped so tightly they were white, but his voice was steady. He was no longer the broken man from the ER. Here, in a room where his daughter's life was being mapped out, he was a warrior again, focused and resolute. Later that afternoon, while Lily was sleeping off the effects of a sedative from a new round of tests, they sat in the quiet of her room. The silence between them was no longer hostile, just heavy with unspoken thoughts. My wife Clara, Owen said suddenly, his voice soft. She was a musician, a violinist. She used to say that the silences between the notes were just as important as the notes themselves. He looked over at his sleeping daughter. Lily has her mother's hands. I always thought she'd play. Teresa found herself responding without thinking. My father was a businessman. He used to say silence was a weakness, a void to be filled with a better offer or a stronger argument. She gave a small, wry smile. We come from very different worlds, Owen. No kidding, he murmured, but for the first time there was no bitterness in his voice. It was just a statement of fact. A fragile truce was forming in the quiet of the hospital room, a shared moment of humanity, but it was shattered by the sharp, intrusive buzz of Teresa's phone. She glanced at the screen. It was her chief of staff, Mara. It was urgent. She stepped out into the hallway to take the call. What is it, Mara? Mara's voice was tight with stress. It's bad, Teresa. Gavin Shaw called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. The agenda item is a vote of no confidence in your leadership. Teresa's blood ran cold. On what grounds? It's the journalist Davenport. He published the story. It's online now and it's spreading like wildfire. Mara read the headline aloud, her voice flat. CEO's charity match scandal. Did Teresa Langley pay off a janitor to cover a public humiliation? The article is full of quotes from anonymous sources at the resort. It paints you as an arrogant bully and Owen as a sympathetic victim you're now trying to silence with your money. Gavin is using it as proof that your erratic and emotional behavior is a liability to the company. He's framing the donation for Lily's surgery as hush money. Teresa leaned against the wall, the sleek, calm hospital corridor suddenly feeling like it was tilting. She had seen this coming, but the speed and viciousness of it still took her breath away. Gavin wasn't just trying to wound her, he was going for a kill shot. He won't win, Teresa said, her voice a low growl. I hope not, Mara replied, but he has momentum. The board is spooked. You need to get back here, Teresa. You need to fight this. She hung up the phone, her mind racing, 1,000 strategies and counter moves vying for attention. She had built Langley Enterprises from the ground up, fighting off rivals and predators her entire life. She was not about to lose it now. She turned to go back into Lily's room and saw Owen standing in the doorway. He had overheard everything. The look on his face wasn't anger or pity. It was a dawning horror. The look of a man realizing he was not just the recipient of a rescue, but the anchor pulling his rescuer under the waves. Her act of salvation was going to cost her an empire. I won't let you do this, Owen said, stepping fully into the hallway. The weary resignation was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective urgency. I won't be the reason you lose your company. Call it off, all of it. The surgery, the trust. We'll find another way. Teresa turned, her phone still in her hand, and gave him a look of sheer disbelief. Another way? We just sat in a room with one of the best surgeons in the world who told you there is no other way. Are you listening to yourself? It's my problem, not yours, he insisted, his voice rising. I'll sell my story to that reporter Davenport. I'll do interviews. I'll figure it out, but I will not let you be destroyed because of me. You think Gavin Shaw cares about you? She shot back, her voice sharp as steel. She was in her element now, a battlefield of corporate warfare. This isn't about you, Owen. It was never about you. You're just a pawn he's using to get to me. He's been trying to build a case against me for years. If I back down now, if I show a single moment of weakness, he wins. Is that what you want, for a man like that to win? She took a step closer, her eyes blazing. He's not just coming for my company, he's coming for your daughter's only chance. The two are now connected, so you can either stand there feeling noble and sorry for yourself, or you can get ready to fight. Her phone buzzed again. It was a secure message from Mara. Teresa's eyes scanned the text, her expression shifting from anger to a deep, focused intensity. It was the background check on Owen. All the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place. She looked up at him, seeing him in a new light. "Owen the Rocket Harper," she said softly. "Youngest player to ever win the Miami Open. You were sponsored by Blackwood Athletics. You were unstoppable." Owen flinched as if she'd struck him. "Don't." She ignored him, her mind assembling the facts into a strategy. "You married Clara Reyes, a violinist with the City Philharmonic. 8 years ago, you were both in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. Clara was killed instantly. You sustained a compound fracture to your left knee, ending your career. The trauma of the accident triggered a latent genetic condition in your daughter, Lily. Her heart was damaged. You sued the driver, but he was uninsured and had no assets. You got nothing." Owen stared at her, his face ashen. How do you know all that?" "And Silas Blackwood," she continued, her voice relentless, "the owner of Blackwood Athletics. He tried to sue you for breach of contract when you couldn't play anymore. The press crucified him for it, so he dropped the suit, but your relationship was destroyed. He's a vindictive, bitter man, and I'd be willing to bet he's the anonymous source feeding information to that reporter right now." She finally paused, letting the weight of his unearthed past settle in the sterile hallway. "They've written a story about you, Owen, a story where you're a fraud and I'm a monster. It's a simple, ugly narrative, and right now it's winning." "So what do we do?" he whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold dread. "We tell a better story," Teresa said, her eyes glinting with a familiar predatory light. "We tell the truth." She looked him straight in the eye. "Gavin's board meeting is Monday. We're not going to hide. We're going to go on the offensive. Sunday night, we're doing a live primetime television interview, you and me together." The color drained completely from Owen's face. "What number? Absolutely not. I've spent the last 8 years hiding from that story. I will not put my daughter through that. I will not sit in front of millions of people and talk about the worst day of my life." "You have to," she insisted, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its urgency. "Don't you see? The only weapon we have against a lie is the truth. The world doesn't see a grieving father who gave up everything for his child. They see a janitor who pulled a fast one. We have to show them who you are, who we are." She saw the terror in his eyes, the deep instinctual need to run and hide. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him outside of that perfunctory handshake. "I know I am the last person you want to trust, Owen. I know I did this, but we are in this together now. They're calling you a fraud and me an unstable mess. The only way to win is to show them a father fighting for his daughter and a woman who, for once in her life, is standing for something more than a stock price." "Please," she said, the word feeling strange and powerful, "help me fight for us." He looked from her face to the closed door of his daughter's room. Behind that door was the only thing in the world that mattered. The world saw him as a janitor. Teresa saw him as a pawn. Gavin Shaw saw him as a weapon, but Lily just saw him as daddy. He had to protect that, and Teresa, for all her flaws, was right. The only way to protect it was to define it himself. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The breath of a man about to dive into freezing, dark water. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it." The television studio was an ecosystem of controlled panic. Technicians scurried through a forest of cables. Producers whispered urgently into headsets, and the air itself felt charged with a low-voltage hum of anticipation. Owen sat stiffly in a plush armchair under lights that felt as hot and unforgiving as the sun on that fateful tennis court. His hands were clammy, and his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was infinitely more terrifying than facing down a Grand Slam opponent. Beside him, Teresa Langley was an island of perfect calm. She had shed her corporate armor for a simple, elegant navy blue dress. She looked not like a CEO in crisis, but like a woman about to have a quiet, serious conversation. Before the cameras went live, she leaned over to him, her voice a low murmur only he could hear. "Just tell them about Lily," she said. "Look at the camera and pretend you're telling one person your story. That's all you have to do. I'll handle the rest." The interviewer, a famously incisive journalist named Diane Sawyer, began the segment with a killer's precision. She laid out the scandal, quoting from Davenport's inflammatory article, her questions sharp and pointed. "Miss Langley, your rival, Gavin Shaw, alleges that your $50,000 prize and subsequent multi-million-dollar trust for the Harper family is nothing more than hush money to cover up an act of public bullying. How do you respond?" Teresa met the question head-on, her gaze unwavering. "I respond by saying that Mr. Shaw is partially correct. My behavior on that court was arrogant and inexcusable. I used my position to humiliate a man I saw as beneath me, and it is a moment I will regret for the rest of my life." The raw public admission stunned Diane into a rare silence. "But Mr. Shaw is wrong about the rest," Teresa continued, her voice softening as she turned to Owen. "This isn't hush money. This is what happens when you are humbled enough to finally see the truth. And the truth isn't my story, it's his." Diane turned to Owen, her expression shifting from adversarial to curious. "Mr. Harper, the world knew you as the Rocket and then you were gone. What happened? Owen swallowed hard, the heat of the lights making his skin prickle. He took Teresa's advice, picturing Lily's face, and began to speak. He spoke of his wife Clara, of her love for music, and the life they had planned. Then, his voice cracking, he told them about the accident, the screech of tires, the impossible choice to give up his career to care for the only piece of his wife he had left. "I didn't take a janitor's job because I failed," he said, his voice gaining a quiet strength. "I took it because it had hours that allowed me to be home for every doctor's appointment. I took it because it was anonymous, a quiet place where I could be a father and nothing else. All I wanted was to protect my daughter, to give her a peaceful life." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "When Ms. Langley made that challenge, I didn't care about the insult. All I saw was the prize money, a number that meant one more month of medicine, one more consultation. I was fighting for my daughter. I'm always fighting for my daughter." The interview was a watershed moment. The public narrative didn't just flip, it was rewritten entirely. Social media erupted with a tidal wave of support. # Team Owen and # Langley Hero were trending within the hour. Gavin Shaw and Silas Blackwood were cast as the villains in a story of a father's love and a CEO's redemption. The next morning, when Teresa and Owen walked into the Langley Enterprises boardroom, the atmosphere was furial. The board members who had been sharpening their knives just the day before now looked at Teresa with a newfound awe. Gavin Shaw attempted to press his case, but his accusations sounded petty and hollow in the wake of the previous night's raw emotional truth. The vote of no confidence was defeated in a landslide. By the end of the day, Gavin had tendered his resignation in disgrace. 6 months later, the world was a different place. On a bright sunny afternoon, Lily Harper, her cheeks rosy and full, chased a soccer ball across a sprawling green park. A faint silvery scar peeked out from the collar of her shirt, the only visible sign of the marathon she had won. Her laughter, clear and easy, carried on the breeze, the most beautiful sound Owen had ever heard. Dr. Hayes had called the surgery a complete success. Owen was no longer a janitor. He was the director of the newly established Harper Heart Foundation, an organization funded by Teresa's initial trust dedicated to providing financial support for families of children undergoing cardiac care. He ran its sports outreach program, teaching kids with medical challenges how to play and find joy in movement. Teresa stood beside him on the edge of the field, her hand resting comfortably in his. She had delegated more of the day-to-day operations of her company, finding that her life had more room in it than she'd ever imagined. Owen watched his daughter run, his heart full. He turned to Teresa, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face. "You know," he said, his voice laced with playful mischief, "after all this, I think you still owe me something." Teresa raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, and what would that be?" "A marriage," he said simply. "I beat you. The prize was $50,000 and a wedding. I believe you're in breach of contract, Miss Langley." She laughed, a real genuine laugh that reached her eyes. It was a sound he had come to love. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Harper?" He took her hand, lifting it to his lips and kissing her knuckles. His eyes were serious now, filled with a love and gratitude that was deeper than any ocean. "It is," he said. "Marry me, Teresa. Help me build a boring, happy, quiet life." "I think," she said, her own eyes shining as she leaned in to kiss him, "that's the best business proposal I've ever had." Lily, seeing them, came running over, throwing her arms around both of them in a fierce hug. And there in the afternoon sun, the CEO, the janitor, and the little girl with a mended heart stood together. A family finally whole, and that's a wrap on this story. But you know, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Let us know down below what part of the world this reached today, and maybe one word that says how it made you feel. It's incredible to think we're creating this sort of map of emotions together. What we're trying to do here is build a home for stories that actually matter. Stories about getting back up, about forgiveness, and that quiet kind of strength. If you want to help us build it, a subscription and a simple like goes a very long way. It tells the world that these stories are wanted, and it helps them travel to places we could never reach alone. I'm just so grateful you chose to spend your time here. Until we meet in another tale, try to be the kindness you want to see out there.